We are going to have a look at the game Fabiano Caruana against Levon Aronian from round 2 of the Sinquefield Cup in St. Louis. And it's a fascinating encounter between two of the world's best players. And the reason it's so fascinating is because they both failed to understand what was happening on the board. And I will try to make it more clear for you, to give you an impression of the thought process of both players and also show you what could have done better. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and then I'm going to show you what happened in the game. Fabi goes for 1e4, and it's once again the most popular opening of the moment for many years already. It's the Berlin defense. We have recently seen it. Magnus playing with the white pieces twice against the Berlin in the European Team Championships, covered also on the channel. And well, Magnus castled here. He played the move d4. The other main line played by Fabi is the move d3. Modest continuation to keep some play into the position. White just simply defends the pawn on e4. Bishop c5, getting the bishop out to his active square. And after bishop takes c6, d takes c6, this position has been seen already thousands of times. White has a lot of possibilities. Probably you should not just take here on e5 because of queen d4 and it's a double attack. That's one mistake. But apart from that, basically any legal move is playable. The most common ones are knight bd2 or just a simple move castling kingside. I think that makes a lot of sense. But Fabi picks the 10th popular move in the position, the move c3. Not played that often, but c3 makes some sense. You probably want to go for the move d4 at some point, but it's always a pity to have played first the move d3 and only then you play the move d4. So you play it in 2 times, you move your pawn to that square. But it's a position. That's what you want to get out of the opening, and it's a playable position. Definitely this move caught Aronian by surprise. He goes for knight d7 to protect the pawn on e5, and white plays the move d4. So white is advancing its pawns in the center, occupying the center with both its pawns. And what should black do? Well, it does make sense just to drop back with the bishop to d6 to overprotect the pawn on e5. Seems to me a reasonable idea and something which has been seen in other lines of the Berlin as well. But Aronian goes for a very ambitious move. He takes the pawn on d4, c takes d4, giving white the full center. White attacks the bishop, so the bishop goes away. Can go to b6, can go back to e7. Well, first a check was given on b4. Bishop d2, white blocks the check. And now interesting decision as the move a5 is played. Black doesn't want to trade off the bishops himself, but is waiting for white to take the bishop on b4. Because after a takes b4, this pawn on b4 is kind of annoying. It covers the c3 square, so white cannot develop its knight to that square. The rook has been activated. The a file is half open. So white is not going to take. White maintains the tension and just castles here. Black does the same. And now the bishop is no longer pinned. And the move bishop g5 is played. White hits the queen on d8. Black played the move f6 to stop the threat and counterattack the bishop. And the bishop goes to h4. So white has a nice center and has the responsibility to take care of these pawns. Well, black first wants to complete its development. The bishop on c8 wants to join play, and therefore the knight comes to b6 to make some space for this bishop. White played the move a3, attacking the bishop. The bishop goes back to e7, and white plays the move rook to e1, supporting the pawn on e4. Black goes bishop e6. So the bishop has been developed. Now black, all its pieces are in play. Knight bd2, so the same can be said for white. And how should we evaluate this position? Well, I think black is very solid here. Like, he has the bishop pair, and of course white has a nice pawn center. But thanks to the pawns on c6 and f6, it will definitely not be easy for white to advance the pawns and try to extend its space advantage in the center. What I think black should do is either playing a move like a4 to clamp down on the b3 square. If the knight is ever going to move, you may put your bishop there. That's a good idea. Also, the move queen d7 makes a lot of sense because there's this rule that the stage of the opening is only finished when the rooks are connected. I think black is rock solid here. But Aronian goes for a different move. He goes for a more active way of playing. And I don't like it because he played here the move knight c4. And it seems like he wants to gain control over the c4 square. But what I rather would have done here as black is to wait for white to move its knight away from d2. In general, I don't like knights protecting each other. These pieces are not that flexible. And if that knight would ever move, let's say to f1, then you can also put your knight on c4. So why does black trade off these knights? I'm not sure, and I don't like it. So white does exchange the pair of knights, knight c4, bishop c4, and now the rook comes to c1 to attack the bishop on c4. Bishop goes back to f7, and now bishop g3. So here we see that the bishop is now eyeing the pawn on c7. Black played the move a4, the idea I've already mentioned before. Makes a lot of sense, so at some point the bishop can come there. White played the move rook c3, improving the rook so that it can be activated along the third rank. Rook e8 was played, so black also places its rook on the half-open file to contest that pawn on e4 anytime. h3 is played, a useful waiting move to make sure that there is never any back rank mate, of course. Bishop f8, so now the rook does put pressure against the pawn on e4. And now, interesting moment, white played the move queen to c1. What is the queen doing here? Well, together with the rook, it does put some pressure along the c file. And after the move queen d7, now it's time to start the action with the move d5. White is advancing its pawn to d5, attacking the pawn on c6. If you do take the pawn on d5, there is rook takes c7. And that's something black definitely doesn't want to allow, because the queen is under threat, the rook is active, pawn on b7 is targeted as well. So let's take it back. Black doesn't want to take, but rather advances the pawn to c5. Now white has advanced its pawns in the center, but still, what are these pawns going to do next? At the moment, black does have perfect control over the next squares d6 and e5. So I think there's absolutely no reason to worry here for black. Rook c2 e3. The rook is working together with its colleague on the e file to protect the pawn, and maybe there are other ideas at some point. Let me show you that black is definitely not able now to play the move c6. It's the move you would like to play to challenge the head of the pawn chain, but it runs into the move d6, and white gets a passed pawn. It's protected by the bishop, and the bishop from f8 cannot take that pawn on d6 because of rook d1, and you're going to lose the bishop because of this tactic along the d file. So let's take it back. c6 is not a good move, but black is still in control. Played here the move rook a6. That's an original way of getting the rook into play, but the rook is doing fine along the 6th rank. It's helping. If white ever advances the pawn to e5, the rook can swing over from one side to another. Otherwise, the rook can also come to b6. That's looking fine. White played here the move rook to d1. So white is also looking for the right plan, but both pawns are well supported. Bishop comes to h5. That's a very annoying pin on the knight. So the rook went back. And of course, that's a silent draw over. But the reason the rook goes back is that black was about to take on f3. But here you can just take back with the rook, as the other rook is now defending the pawn on e4. Now you understand why the rook goes back. Well, black, of course, is happy with an draw, so he goes for the move bishop f7 back, just checking what the opponent is going to do now. And Fabi, not interested in going for a repetition, keeps the game alive with the move queen c2, overprotecting the pawn one more time, and black plays actively with b5, mobilizing its majority on the queen side. That's an interesting idea. Now the rook even comes back to d1, and I think black should just be patient. There's absolutely no reason not to play a move like bishop h5. Black cannot really do that much. His position is cramped, but doesn't contain any weaknesses. Instead, Aronian, maybe he even felt that he is better at this point, because he played here the move c6, believing that if this pawn is gone, the position gets more open and he can bear its fruits of the pair of bishops. But there is this move, d6. White advances the pawn, and the passed pawn is fantastically supported by the rook and the bishop, but this was a conscious decision by Aronian as he was planning to go ahead here with the move bishop b3. This was the idea behind this provocation. Now black is winning an exchange, but things are far from simple. Rook takes b3, a takes b3. And now big question, which pawn are you going to capture? Well, if you take the pawn on c5, white will have a huge advantage because you don't have to care about this pawn on e4. The knight will come into d4 and the plan is simple. You want to wrap up this pawn on b3, move the queen away and bring your knight to c5. That is the main plan. We get to see something very similar in the game, but in a different version, because white just captured the pawn on b3 with check. And now black is able to play here this move, c4, stopping the check, attacking the queen. The queen went to e3 to protect the pawn. Queen c2 is another possibility, of course. With the queen on e3, you try to push the pawn forward, like you can try to play the move e5 anytime soon. I think this is a critical moment in the game because white obviously has compensation for the exchange, because this pawn on d6, it's far advanced, it's well supported, and there are no open files for the rook. So it's difficult for black to activate its best pieces. But what should black do? I think black has to be very careful. And in the game, they follow the move c3. This is a radical way of trying to open up the files, but I think this is a mistake. So instead, after the move queen e3, what should black have done? For instance, a waiting move like h6. It's nothing special, but I want to show you that for white it's also difficult to activate these two minor pieces. If you play e5, then you're hoping that black is going to take and the knight comes in to attack the queen, and if the queen moves, the d-pawn comes forward. That's the main strategy, to remove the main blockader. But black can, for instance, play the move c5, and the pawn on e5 is pinned. It cannot take the pawn on f6, obviously, because the queen is hanging, but with c5 you're giving that pawn away. But the point is that now you want to take on e5. There are a lot of tactics. This all didn't happen in the game, but it's just to illustrate my point. If you play bishop takes e5 to keep the pawn defended, well, there's rook d8, and now there are 4 pieces of black attacking the pawn on d6. It's only 3 times defended, and black is in okay shape if he can get rid of that pawn on d6. But the critical line, of course, is knight takes e5. Knight captures the pawn, hits the queen. But look at this. There's this brilliant tactical resource for black to take on d6 with the rook, eliminate white's main asset. The point is that if you take the queen on d7, it's rook takes d1 with check, and after the king goes away, it's time to take the bishop now. And black is up a lot of material and will win the game. So therefore white doesn't have a chance to win the queen on d7. Instead, you should take on d6, queen takes d6, for instance, queen takes b5. Now the game is even. White has a knight and 2 pawns for the rook, but black has freed its position. There's no longer a passed pawn, and the game goes on with even chances. So something like that should have happened. Instead, they follow the move c3. So what is the idea? Well, if you take with the b pawn, the rook can take on a3. That's not a good idea. So white takes with the queen. That's a much better move. And now it's rook takes e4. So the rook becomes active, and at least there is an open file. But what is the main drawback of this is that now, because this pawn on c4 is no longer there, this knight from f3 can be improved via d2 to b3 and c5. Knight e2 was played in the game. Rook is under threat. Rook e8, and the knight comes to b3, threatening knight c5 with a knight fork. Queen went away, and now the queen went to f3 to keep an eye on this pawn on c6. Well, they followed this move. Rook to a7, trying to gain control over the d7 square so that white's pawn cannot be advanced any further. Now, you cannot take the pawn on c6 because the knight on b3 can be taken. There's queen takes e8, and also the rook on d1 can be taken. So black will win the game in that case. So let's take it back, and instead they follow the move knight to c5. Now, white is about to take this pawn on c6. So they followed the move rook to c8. Everything is well under control. If you advance the pawn to d7 too quickly, the rook will just come back, and by advancing the pawn to d7, you're opening up the diagonal for the bishop, and black is about to eliminate that monster of a knight on c5. Therefore, white should not rush. They followed b4 to strengthen the knight. Look at this fantastic knight. It's much better than black's rooks. Black cannot do much, difficult to activate your best pieces. They followed h6, rook d3, overprotecting the pawn. f5 was played. Now white making slow moves to improve its position. Played here bishop f4. What is going to happen? Well, black played g5. Black didn't want to wait any further. Played g5 to attack the bishop, but this opens up its king's protection. So bishop comes to e5. Queen g6 played. I think black is really kicking himself here for ending up in this position. White has a big opportunity to play for a win here. He played the move Queen d1, Fabi, but maybe it's better to play rook to d1 with the idea so that, for instance, after a move like bishop g7, black wants to get rid of that annoying bishop. There will follow d7, hitting the rook on c8, and after rook d8, the queen come into b3, and there are so many threats. The pawn is really strong. Rook will come to d6 to attack the queen. The attack continues with the help of the passed pawn. And one interesting line is that black cannot play here queen f7 because of the exchange of queens. And now after bishop takes g7, king takes g7, there is a knight fork, and with check and hitting the rook on d8, white is winning material. So this is a very nice illustration that you're not in a rush here at all as white. But they followed the move queen d1. Not bad, but after rook to d8, they followed the move f4. Fabi has a totally different plan. He wants to open up the g file. So they follow g takes f4, bishop takes f4, with the idea to set up a huge threat against the king. But at the same time, it also activates black's rook, because now the rook comes over to g7, threatening checkmate on g2, and that's something you didn't want to allow. Now, instead of going for an attack with your own pieces, these pieces, they need to cover the threat. So queen d2 was played, queen protects the mating, threat on g2, queen f6. Black is looking possibly for counterplay, but also keeps an eye on this pawn on d6, and it's not easy at all here to prove that that the pawn is dangerous at all. Queen a2 was played here with check, and now queen f7. Black is blocking the check. Still, you're here for an essential choice. Are you going for the exchange of queens, or you're going to trade them off? Well, I think white is fighting for the initiative, and you should not go for the exchange of queens. It was played by Fabi, but after king takes f7, the king joins play and is close to support the other pieces, wrapping up that pawn on d6. Note that a move like d7 with the idea to go bishop c7 and gain control over the promotion square runs into this move. Bishop takes c5 with check, b takes c5, and now very elegant move. King just goes back to g8. It's a safe square for the king. There are no checks of a rook or a bishop. And next you can just take the pawn on d7, and black is an exchange up. Therefore, after king takes f7, you have to be very careful. There follow the move knight b7, hitting the rook on d8. The rook goes to d7 to attack the knight. The knight goes back, rook d8, and the players agreed to a draw after a free-fought repetition. I thought this was a very instructive game, hoping that you also realize that a knight can sometimes just be stronger when the position is closed than the rooks. They are simply not able to become active. I think both players made some instructive mistakes. It was just a draw, but a very tense game.